Up next, a look at the presidency of Lyndon B. Johnson. Panelists discuss how LBJ viewed government's role, and they explore his efforts at instituting civil rights legislation and social reform. CBS Washington correspondent Bob Schieffer moderates this panel. New York's Hunter College hosted this hour-long event.
Fantastic. It's now my pleasure to introduce this extraordinary panel. They're supposed to flash some pictures up here. The guy with all the hair, that's me. A few years ago, so I don't have to introduce myself. Maybe they can run those. And that's, yeah, there we are. Okay. And the next one is Irvin Duggan, right there. He still has a lot of hair. It's a little gray, but Irv, come on out. Irv was one of Johnson's aides. He left the Washington Post to come work at the White House on education and welfare and civil rights. He was a commissioner of the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, for 5 years, 6 years as president and CEO of the Public Broadcasting System, and now he is president and CEO of the Society for Four Arts in Palm Beach. And if you ever go to Palm Beach, you should look him up. That's an incredible operation he's got down there. Senator George McGovern, my God. A World War II bomber pilot who received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his heroism, a history teacher, a member of the House. He was elected senator in 1962, opposed the war in Vietnam vigorously. He was a Democratic candidate for president in 1972. Actually, I got to know him best then. I was the counsel for the Democratic Party then, and George called me one day and from South Dakota when his vice presidential candidate, Tom Eagleton, had gotten into trouble, and said, how do you change the candidate for vice president? I said, I don't know. He said, well, you better find out. You're my lawyer. He left the Senate, stayed in the Senate in 1980. He's done lots of work on Food for Peace. And this July, if I'm right, George, you will celebrate your 90th birthday, 90 years young. Walter Mondale, Vice President of the United States under Jimmy Carter. God, don't we wish we had men like that in Washington today? I got to know he was Attorney General of Minnesota. Then he was appointed senator in 1964 to take Hubert Humphrey's place when LBJ was elected president. Humphrey vice president. 1966 he was elected in his own right. He was the Democratic Party nominee for president in 1984. Ambassador to Japan for 4 years in the 1990s. He is still practicing law in Minneapolis, and when he was vice president, I think it's fair to say that no one was more responsible for my getting the job as Secretary of HEW than you were. So, wonderful, wonderful man. Bill Moyers, probably, Bill. One of our country's most prolific and respected journalists, 35 Emmys, a 40-year run on public broadcasting with a new series this year. I think it's Moyers and Company. He helped organize the Peace Corps. He was press secretary and a close confidant of LBJ, publisher of Newsday, a best-selling author. And, you know, when Bill called me, I was working in the Pentagon. When Bill called me and said, you know, you got to come over here and work in the White House. And I said, well, he said, no, he said, it'll be fun. Bill, I never knew what fun was until I started working for Lyndon Johnson. And last, our moderator, Bob Schieffer. He is the CBS News chief in Washington, chief Washington correspondent. Moderator of Face the Nation. All of you who rue the fact that Face the Nation is only half an hour, it is going to an hour beginning in April, and we look forward to that, Bob. He's covered all four major Washington beats: the White House, the State Department, the Pentagon, and Capitol Hill. I think he's proudest of all, he said once, of the fact that his university, Texas Christian University, has named their School of Journalism the Schieffer School of Journalism. Wow. We have, I'll turn it over to Bob, but first, this is Lyndon Johnson talking to Everett Dirksen about an excise tax problem he has, to kind of give you a sense of what it was like.
Now, you're not going to beat me on excise taxes and run my budget this year. I've got ways and means holding hearings, and we're going to come up with a recommendation one way or the other. But don't beat me on that now. You can do it if you want to, and you can run my budget, but you're hollering the economy and trying to balance it. Now, cut the deficit 50% under what Kennedy had it. Now, if you screw me up on excise taxes and get that thing going, I'll have hell. Now, let my Ways and Means Committee...
Now, look at the pressure I'm under.
No, you're not on it.
Trade Association.
Well, I know it, but God, you also for good fiscal prudence, and you know that the way to do this is through the House Committee, and you know if you put it in, you're not going to get it. They're not going to let you all write a bill over in the Senate on taxes, you know. Now, please don't press me on that. Well, who are you going to take? You going to take all your Republicans? Give me one or two of them, and let them be prudent. You've got people on there that can...
Well, you got enough votes to beat.
No, I haven't. You can beat me, and you ought to do it. And you see how you're going to let me win by one vote in there, and I'll call you back in a little bit on this.
You never talked that way when you were sitting in that front seat.
Yeah, well, I did if my country's involved. I voted for Ike one time. When Nolan voted against him, I cast the vote on his foreign aid and brought it out of the committee.
You're a hard bargainer.
No, I'm not. But you just take care of me, and I'll look at this and see what I can do and call you right back.
All right.
Well, I think the first question to ask at this gathering here of this distinguished group, Joe Califano, do you think anybody talks on the telephone to anybody else in Washington like that today?
No. I don't think there's anything like that at all. I mean, it was rare. It was rare even in those days, but it was nobody talking like him.
I just reread Harry McPherson's book. Harry McPherson was an aide to Lyndon Johnson. It's a wonderful book. And he has in there, at one point, he said, Lyndon Johnson could deliver because he had a firm working relationship with Republican leaders. He said the bolder, the more sweeping, the more complex the program that a president submits to Congress, the more necessary it is that he and his helpers practice the non-intellectual art of personal politicking with men and women of both parties. He says the grasp of the issues and the facility of expression are seldom sufficient to get the job done. And it seems to me, I wonder, and I just want to talk to each of you today, has Washington lost the ability to negotiate? Have they lost the ability to make a deal? It's not that way anymore. Joe, why don't we just go around the horn here?
Well, I think they have lost the ability to make a deal, and I think it's, I think Senator McGovern can certainly talk about it. Even when he was virtually calling for Johnson to get out of the White House, was still talking to him about food stamp programs and everything else. I mean, I think we've lost that. And just one example, I mean, my recollection, Bill can check me, but was fundamentally, he said, you treat Everett Dirksen, who was the minority leader in the Senate, the same way you treat Mike Mansfield. You treat Jerry Ford, same way you treat Speaker McCormick. They want something, you help them. We need them. We need them. And, those bills, those civil rights bills never could have happened without Republican votes. And lots of other bills never could have happened. And he also used to say with respect to Medicare, it's a complicated piece of legislation. If we don't have half the Republicans, we'll never get these health care bills, all these complicated bills through, because they'll beat us in the states, they'll beat us in the appropriations committees, their guys in the corporations will beat us. So he inculcated us with that.
Well, you mentioned Senator McGovern. Talk about that a little bit, Senator, because you were on the other end of a lot of it. I mean, you were against the war, you fought him. It was an epic battle, but yet he still kept a part of that relation sort of compartmentalized, didn't he? Because frankly, he needed you on a couple of things.
Well, before I ran for president, I had been hammering our Vietnam involvement for 10 years. I finally decided that the Senate's a great place, but one senator from a small populated state like South Dakota is not going to have much impact on a national policy such as a war. And I called up the White House, and Bill Moyers took my call. And I said, do you think you could arrange for me to see the president? And without thinking about it too long, he said, yes, you can. You want to come tonight about 7 o'clock? The very same night. I thought he'd say it'd be a week or so before we can get to you, but that was the way the Johnson White House functioned. It's the way the president functioned. So I walked in there that night. It was the first time I had been in the Oval Office, and I have to confess, I was kind of overwhelmed with the atmosphere. And Johnson was a big man. He got up and he took hold of both of my lapels here, and he stood up. He was 2 or 3 inches taller than I was. He got his head way back like this. I was looking right up his nostrils. And I learned later this was called the nostril treatment. And he said, now, George, I know why you're here to talk to me. I had Joe Rao in here the other day, and he wants me to just pull out of there today. Get our troops out of there. You know I can't do that. Then I have Scoop Jackson in here, and he thinks we ought to bomb the hell out of him. And I can't do that. So I'm just following a common sense middle course. I'm trying to honor the troops that are there. I'm trying to keep in mind that the standing of the United States in the world is on the line, and we just can't surrender to a bunch of little communists out there in Vietnam. It was difficult for me to speak after that, but I said, well, Mr. President, I have a memorandum here. I don't want to take too much of your time, but I'd like to leave that with you. It kind of reviews the history of how we got in there. It also tells what happened to the French. They had the best army in Europe in Vietnam, and they got whipped by those miserable communists out there. And he said, I can't either throw bombs at them or I can't pull out. I'm just trying to follow a middle course. I said, well, maybe you can look over my remarks. He said, George, God darn it, don't give me another memorandum. I got a drawer full of memorandums from Bill Fulbright and Mike Mansfield and God knows how many else, and I don't have time for history right now. I've got boys out there on the front line that are dying, that are fighting for their country. I can't sit around here reading history lessons. So I thought I wasn't communicating very well, and I thanked him for listening to me, and I left. But he never held my opposition to the war against me. Do you think he did, Bill? You were in the White House then.
No, you were exceptional.
Right after I won the presidential nomination in '72, I called him and said, we'd like to come down to Texas and see you. And Sarge Shriver, who was one of my vice presidents, went down with me, and they met us at the plane. We landed right at the ranch, and the president and Lady Bird were each driving a golf cart. Sarge went with Lady Bird, and I went with the president. We went up to the house, and it was a delightful experience. He said, now let's get one thing clear, George. You think I'm crazy for keeping us in Vietnam all these years. I didn't start that war, but I'm expected to finish it. And I know you think I'm goofy on it. I think you are. So let's not talk about Vietnam. And he gave me some good advice. He said, George, if I were you, you've been a great critic of your government the last 10 years. If I were you, I would announce for president telling the country how much they have done for you and how much the United States government means to you. Tell them about your war days. Tell them about what you, as a junior senator from South Dakota, the debt you feel to the people of the United States. You know, he couldn't have given me better advice. I'm sorry that other things crowded in, and I didn't stick with that routine very much, but I should have. I think I'd have gotten more votes. I might have carried 2 states instead of one.
Bill Moyers, what was it like to just work for Lyndon Johnson?
You had to run just to stay up when he was walking. He never stopped. He was consuming in his passions and in objectives and demanding, but he never asked more of us than he gave himself. It took 12 of us, 10 of us, I think there were in the White House, to just keep up with him. He was 13, as I've said before, of the most interesting, complicated men I have ever met. And playing his moods and reading them and trying to integrate them and advance an agenda that all of us had a part of was really a demanding task. It was exhilarating, it was exhausting, it was rewarding, and it was sometimes punishing. But you always were satisfied that the result made the effort worthwhile.
Evan, how did he know so much? I mean, he seemed to know everything about everybody.
Well, J. Edgar Hoover helped him. He was a sponge of political intelligence. Today, big controversy over these political intelligence firms that look for the intelligence. Lyndon Johnson got it in the normal course of his business. He had the 3 teletype machines in his office, the 3 television sets in his office. He talked incessantly to people. You thought when he was talking, he was only talking, but not. He was listening to your responses and to the silence between the sentences of your response. And he always knew other people's price, other politicians' price. For some, it was a dinner at the White House. For some, it was a signed photograph for a mother-in-law. For others, it was a dam. He once said to Frank Church, senator from Idaho, who he never forgave the way he did you for opposing him, when Senator Church tried to tell him what to do about Vietnam and started quoting Walter Lippmann, then the prominent columnist of the day, LBJ said, "I'll tell you what, Frank, the next time you want a dam on the Snake River, you go talk to Walter Lippmann about it." But on the original point, I spent more time at his instruction with Republicans than I did with Democrats, because he knew, as you said, he was going to need those votes. And Judith and I, we worked together on our broadcast, and we were screening a small clip the other day from the signing of the 1964 Act, Civil Rights Act, to which Walter was the floor manager and delivered. And when he finished signing that act with all of the pins, one would have thought, I thought, standing in the back of the room, he would take the first pin and hand it to Martin Luther King. He didn't. He took the first pin and handed it to Everett Dirksen. That was Everett Dirksen's reward for doing what Lyndon Johnson thought he persuaded him to do in that phone call. He understood the importance. You ask about Washington today, President Obama does not enjoy personal persuasion. He doesn't like other politicians. At least that's the impression I get as a journalist. I don't know him personally. Lyndon Johnson did. And he also did not have a party of no. The Republican Party today is not the party that we confronted and ran against in 1964. It's a party of no. So much rhetoric has poisoned people's attitudes toward the government that it's to the Republican Party's interest to make government inefficient so that they can use it to gain power. We didn't have that. There were still, even on the most of the Republican side, Burke Hickenlooper even from Iowa, people like that, a desire to make government work, even though they wanted a smaller government than we did. And there was that feeling that government needed to deliver. And he exploited that, knowing that they had that in common. That isn't the case today. And you know that better than anybody.
Let me ask you, Evan, you were a young staffer working for him. We know he liked FDR and sort of almost thought of him as his father, but who were his role models?
Well, I asked him once in the closing months of the administration, we were flying to Texas, and there wasn't as much to do, and we had more time to talk. And I asked him on the plane, what other politician, Mr. President, other than yourself, do you most admire? I phrased it carefully. And I expected that he would say Richard Russell of Georgia. I expected that he would say FDR, who clearly there was an umbilical link between the two of them. I expected he might say Mr. Sam Rayburn. Without hesitation, he said, the most skilled politician I ever knew in Washington was Dwight D. Eisenhower. And he began talking about Eisenhower's political genius, which was a revelation to me. And he said, who do you think the first person was that I called from Air Force One after the assassination, on the second person after I called Rose Kennedy? I called Eisenhower. And I said, I haven't been elected in this terrible tragedy. I don't know what to do. I want you to come to Washington right away and give me advice. And he said, Eisenhower came down from Gettysburg, and he said, Mr. President, I'm a military man. I give advice in writing. And my secretary, Ann Whitman, is in retirement in an apartment on Connecticut Avenue. Let her come down, and I will dictate to you while you go to the events of the funeral. I'll dictate my advice. And President Johnson said the advice that he wrote in that memo became the script for the first 100 days of my presidency. And he said, during that entire time, when Eisenhower advised me to speak to a joint session of the Congress and make that my inaugural address, to call business leaders together and show the unity of the business community, all these things Eisenhower recommended. Take the Kennedy program and make it a memorial to the slain president. He said, during all the time that I was following the script, my approval ratings were way up in the 70s. And he said, when I came to the last page of the script and it ended, my approval ratings went down to 50. But I thought it was amazing that, and an example of this bipartisanship that you've heard other people on this panel talking about, that he selected a Republican president as the most skilled politician he had known.
Yeah, that's a new story. I'd never heard that
Two
before.
quick points on that. In 1954, when I was a summer employee on his staff, I was 20 years old, a clerk in the mailroom of no significance, but he called me over and insisted that I go to an Eisenhower press conference, the first press conference I'd ever seen of a president. And he said, I can't remember the exact quote, but it was, he said, you watch President Eisenhower. He knows how to get what he wants by not appearing to want it. And Johnson was partly that way. Then on the night we flew back from Dallas after the tragedy there and went to the executive office building where the vice president had his suite, the first call he asked me to make was to Dwight Eisenhower, and he allowed me to listen to that conversation. And again, after that conversation was over, he said, "Oh, amazing man, he said, he just understood how you could get what you want by not appearing to want it." Twice he said that.
Senator Mondale, I'm really struck by what I'm hearing here. Here was a man who called people when he needed help and was not afraid to say, I really need some help here. I really need you to help me. You can talk about both of these worlds. How is, and Bill touched on this, how is Washington today different from what it was in those days?
Well, I think Bill touched on it. I'm, I would say, depressed about it. I was there in the Senate. Young man replaced Humphrey, who became the vice president. Johnson was in his honeymoon period. He had this wonderful program of social justice that I believed in and believe in today. And he was using his energy and his strength, we talked about, to keep the system moving. And he did it on a bipartisan basis. Don't forget that about 20 Democrats were Southerners. And most of them were committed to discrimination, and that was the center of their political careers. A lot of good people there, but that was the reality. So in order to get progressive legislation passed, the numbers told you, unless you could do it on a bipartisan basis, forget it. So everything we did there, and Johnson was leading, Hubert was in there, and the rest, began with how can we make this a bipartisan program. Every civil rights bill of any significance ended up in Dirkson's office. If you wanted a Civil Rights Act, sooner or later, you went to see Dirkson, and if he'd sign on, you could pass it. If he wouldn't, he wouldn't. I remember I handled fair housing, and it looked finally they were going to pass it, and Phil Hart said to me, "What can I do for you?" I said, "Well, I'd like my name on this bill, you know, so I can tell the folks back home I'm getting something done." He said, "Can't do that." He said, I said, "Why not?" He said, "Dirkson's name goes on the bill." and that's how we got things done. Now it seems to me that whole dialogue, everything is a train wreck. There is no sense of getting things done or serving broader purposes, and we got to do something about it. Johnson did in his time. I don't think it's being done now.
Well, what happened? What caused this change, Evan?
I think what we've seen over the years is what might be called the emptying out of the center. Richard Scammon, who was President Kennedy and President Johnson's census director, used to say that the game of politics in America is played between the 45-yard lines. And if you stray into the end zones, you lose support. The Congress of the United States today has emptied out the space between the 45-yard lines, and everybody on both sides is clustered in the end zones. And solutions happen in the center. Solutions happen when people between the 45-yard lines get together and work things out. Practical people. I had a young lawyer working for me at the FCC who once observed that political agnostics are the ones who get things done in Washington, those who are not ideologically so committed to one side or another that they cannot compromise. Mm-hmm. And those political agnostics who simply love the process, who love the idea of solving problems together, get together, and they're not so ideologically divided. They can find solutions together. We've had an emptying out of the center and a filling up of the extremes, both in the country and in the Congress, and I think that's the change.
Well, Joe, I mean, compromise has now become a dirty word. Compromise is something that'll get you beat when you run for Congress now. If you say, I'm willing to.
And you have to give, and God knows we gave. But I think there are a couple other things. I think there was real focus. I mean, I don't think any of us had any doubt about where Johnson wanted to go, what he wanted to get done. Civil rights was an overarching issue. He was going to get it done, whatever other diversions there were, the war on poverty that was mentioned earlier, or the health bills, or what have you. And I think he also knew how to grab an opportunity. I mean, even the grimmest opportunity. We proposed civil rights in 1966, nothing happened. 67, nothing happened. Finally, in early 68, he managed to get it out of the Senate. The Fair Housing Bill, I'm sorry. Finally managed to get the Fair Housing Bill out of the Senate. It was impossible to move it in the House. You may recall Emanuel Seller, the congressman from Brooklyn, Jewish district, with blacks moving in, didn't want to touch the bill. Martin Luther King is assassinated. I will never forget this. It was an awful night. The next morning, he invited all the black leaders in from all across the country to sit around that cabinet table that morning. But he said to me, we're going to get our civil rights bill. Give me a draft of a letter to Speaker McCormick. If we get nothing else, we'll get our fair housing bill now. He sent a letter to the Speaker that morning, and he sent a letter to Jerry Ford. He said, we've got to do this. Then we had to find a floor manager. He knew Seller wouldn't take it. Peter Rodino. Talked Peter Rodino into taking the bill on the floor. Peter Rodino, we passed the Fair Housing Bill within a month. Peter Rodino, incidentally, almost lost re-election in Newark in 1968 because he was a floor manager for that bill. He barely won. But then years later, as he had one black primary opponent after another, he kept beating them because of what he did on the Fair Housing Bill. And the other thing, let me just, Bill knows this. I mean, he had a phenomenal sense of humor. I mean, I think back to the awful riots after the King assassination. I would keep bringing him reports from the FBI. One city after another, we had to bring in troops, and we kept doing that. And then I got this message about Stokely Carmichael, and it was a report. I brought it over to the mansion. Johnson read it. It said Stokely Carmichael is organizing a mob at the corner of 14th and U Streets to march on Georgetown and burn it down. Well, Georgetown was where all these columnists and TV commentators that were driving Johnson crazy lived. And Johnson looked at it, read it. He said, God damn, I've waited 35 years for this night.
Two other quick points on that.
Senator McGovern was just wanting to say something.
I just want to say that as a critic on the Vietnam issue, that before I went into politics, I was a history professor. Do you believe that, Fritz?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. Anyway, I used the GI Bill to go all the way through Northwestern University to a PhD in history. And I think, just thinking about what Johnson did on civil rights, what he did on poverty, what he did on education, all these other things, that whole Great Society program, those were good ideas. Some people ridicule the Great Society. Why would you ridicule a president who was trying to build a great society in the United States? I thought every point in that program made America stronger, and if we'd have gotten the whole thing in full force, it would have made us even stronger. I honestly believe, and I'm speaking now as an old history prof, that with the exception of Roosevelt, who had 4 terms in the White House, I think Lyndon Johnson was the greatest president of the 20th century.
Senator, let me ask you one thing. Do you think that had Kennedy not gone to Vietnam, do you think that had it to do over, do you think Lyndon Johnson would have gone to Vietnam?
Well, I can only say this. I never knew during all that debate time about Vietnam that President Johnson knew that we made a dreadful mistake getting involved in Vietnam militarily. You read a brilliant historian who's on the program tomorrow, Mr. Beschloss, who's written a book, not so much written a book, but published a book on the Johnson tapes. I didn't even know that Johnson had a tape recorder going either. I thought that was just Nixon. But anyway, here's the tapes, and he's talking to Richard Russell of Georgia, who is chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and this is in the first days of when President Johnson was sworn in after John Kennedy's assassination. In those first days, he said, "Dick, what the hell are we going to do about that mess out there in Vietnam? We never should have gotten into that place." And Dick Russell, who I also didn't know felt the same way about it, he says, "I agree. It's a mess. I don't know how you get out of there now. Maybe one thing you could do, you could find those guys out there in Saigon that got rid of old Diem, who was assassinated, and get that gang to send a communique to us asking us to leave." And he said, maybe if our so-called allies out there are asking us to leave, but he says, I don't know how you get that done. Well, he went on at some time about it. Dr. Breslos can give more on this, but Lyndon Johnson understood perfectly everything I knew about Vietnam, everything Fulbright knew, everything Mike Mansfield knew, but he didn't know how, as a sitting president of the United States, to get out of there without looking like he was the first president to surrender in a war. And he was very proud of America. He was proud of our country, and he had great feeling. He was very proud of the United States government, not like these crazy extreme right-wingers that are assailing the federal government day and night on television, wherever they can be heard. Lyndon Johnson loved the United States government. He loved the Senate. He loved the House of Representatives under Sam Rayburn. He admired the Supreme Court. He loved the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the whole shebang. And he just didn't want to surrender under those conditions.
Bill, you were about to.
You feed into what I was going to say a moment ago about what has changed. He was a master parliamentarian. He would have been terrific in the House of Parliament, I think, and he was a great majority leader. That's when I spent some of my time, early time, with him, and he understood procedure, respected procedure. Yes, politics is improvisation. It's scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, but it's also about procedure. And that's changed. When Richard Russell, who was his Dutch uncle, he was much closer to LBJ than LBJ was to FDR. When Richard Russell was beginning to mount a filibuster on the civil rights legislation, LBJ asked him to come down to the White House. And he called me on the phone in my office and said, "Bring me a copy of the Constitution." So I didn't know why, but I took him a copy of the Constitution, and he asked me to stay. And he also said, "Put less scotch in my drink than you put in Richard Russell's," which I did. And so when Russell was ratcheting up his argument about why he had to lead a filibuster, LBJ handed him the Constitution. He said, "Dick, go through that. Russell said, "I've read that, Mr. President. I know what's in the Constitution." He said, "No, I'm serious. Go through it. See, point out to me how many times it mentions the filibuster." The Constitution doesn't mention the filibuster once. One of the great differences is today, we only needed 51 votes to pass historic pieces of legislation. You can't do it now. You've got to get 60 in order to get to a vote on it. And that's changed, and the Republicans have been masters of that, and the Democrats to some extent. But the other thing that he understood very keenly is that it wasn't only procedure, it was understanding what the other fellow, no, it was understand. The other big change, Bob, has been, and I watch you on your show and I see you trying to rationalize with these guys, the delusional has come in from the margin and now occupies centers of power in the Republican Party. We had a great time running against Goldwater in '64 because the right was then funny. It was humorous. And most of our commercials in the '64 campaign were humorous commercials. Today, those delusional people are running one of the two major parties in this country. And there's no rationality with them. There's no reasoning with them. They have an obstinate vision that they pursue irrespective of the facts. And you cannot ultimately run a government based on delusion.
Senator Mondale,
Good point.
we've talked about how Lyndon Johnson operated when he was the majority leader, but you were in the Senate when he was president. What was it like there? I mean, how did you feel his presence? Tom Johnson, who's sitting out here in the audience, told me one time that Johnson had the name and the phone number of every single member of Congress on his desk, and he called people directly. And he said, you know, when it was a big issue, he'd have Cardinal Cushing calling the Catholics, he'd have Billy Graham calling the Baptists, and he'd have Jack Valenti to try to call the Pope if he thought that would help. But what was it like to be in the Senate? I mean, were you ever on the other end when Johnson needed something and maybe you weren't quite ready to give it to him? Or?
Well, I called him several times with things I wanted. And I was always prepared because I knew he was busy and I didn't want to take up too much of his time. And every time he'd talk so long, I began to worry about my time. And he never gave me a damn thing. We just conversation. But I was honored to be talked to that way. I've got one story that Joe knows about. I was handling fair housing on the Senate floor. We had 5 cloture votes, and in those days you needed 67 votes if everybody was there. And on the 5th cloture vote, Mike Manson said, "This is your last one now. You've taken up a month here. There's no more time." And we were 1 vote short. We're almost 6. We just couldn't get that 1 vote. So I went to Hubert and I said, "What do I do?" He said, "Call the president." So I called President Johnson. I think I got him in Puerto Rico.
We were in Puerto Rico.
I explained my situation, and I said, "You know, there's a senator up there in Alaska, Bob Bartlett, who never votes for cloture, but he could. It wouldn't hurt him on this one. But he doesn't want to, but he also wants an auditorium in Anchorage." And the phone clicked off. He stopped talking to me. And Bob Bartlett voted for cloture the next morning. And a month later, there was an announcement at this new auditorium in Anchorage.
What was his relationship like with Humphrey after Humphrey?
It was...
Because I know you were very close to Humphrey.
You know, Hubert and I loved Hubert. And I was thrilled when he became vice president. And I would say, in retrospect, he'd been better off if he hadn't been vice president. I think he had a great career in the Senate. Everybody loved him. He was... This was really tough. He wrote a memo to then President Johnson as the new vice president, warning him about the war in Vietnam. It's one of the most prescient, carefully reasoned possible documents for the president to read, and the president took it as an insult and froze Humphrey out of any meaningful involvement in the Johnson administration for the better part of a half a year. It was very painful, and Humphrey felt it deeply, and I'm afraid Humphrey went around and tried to even do better at supporting the war to try to get back into the president's graces. Humphrey writes about that in his own autobiography. It's really a painful couple of pages, and I don't think Humphrey loved Johnson, but I don't think he ever got over that treatment.
You know,
I'll tell one story. In order to get an airplane to fly the vice president, Humphrey'd have to send a note in to Johnson and say, I need an airplane for this, and then 2 blocks, yes or no on there. And sometimes the letter would come back, no. No explanation. So this sort of thing was painful.
He was a man capable of
ahead,
grand
Joe.
gestures and small cruelties.
Yeah, and you know, on Humphrey, he told a story once. He said, you know, the difference between Humphrey and me, he was sitting in the rocker. He said, Walter Reuther had come in and said, you know, if you don't find a way to rebuild the cities, we're going to burn the cities down. And it was a tough meeting the president had with Reuther. He said, Walter Reuther comes in here to see Hubert and says, if you don't do something, we're going to burn the cities down. And he said, Reuther, the head of the United Auto Workers, who had a crippled hand because he'd been shot during a demonstration, always kept his right hand in his pocket. And he said, Hubert keeps smiling while Reuther's talking, and he's trying to figure out, how can I get Walter Reuther to take his hand out of his pocket so I can shake hands with him? He says, Reuther comes in here and tells me, well, all we're doing, if we don't find a way to rebuild the cities, we're going to burn them down. He said, I'm sitting here, I'm smiling, I'm looking at that hand, I'm trying to get his hand out of his pocket so I can cut his balls off. He said, that's the difference between Hubert and me.
But I think we have to point out, though, that the relationship between a president and a vice president is an inherently difficult relationship. Here is someone who is waiting for you to exit the stage, someone who may have been your rival, someone who may have been equally distinguished in public life. Barbara Bush complained that the Reagans had never invited the Bushes to a state dinner in the White House. Al Gore and Bill Clinton were rumored to have a certain amount of friction in their relationship. It is an inherently difficult relationship, and I think presidents are interested, in spite of the better angels of their nature, in keeping the vice president somewhat humbled. So he may have been unique in his skill at keeping people humbled, but he was not unique in the desire.
Let me ask
He was humbled, Bill. You would have known better.
Well, I don't
but
think
Johnson was humbled when he was Kennedy's vice president.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I was in the Pentagon in those years, and I remember, Bill can tell me, I was serviced the White House. That's how I met Bill and Jack Valenti and all those guys. But I was told one day, Valenti called and said, you know, anything that the vice president asks for, Kenny O'Donnell called and said, anything the vice president asks for from the Pentagon, you've got to clear it here. Anything, you know, a plane ride, an extra aids or what have you. And I thought, well, you know, when Johnson becomes president, having been subjected to that, it'll be another world. And it was a very short time before Valenti called with the same instruction. But you lived in those vice presidential years.
Yes, but I had left to help organize the Peace Corps. I was close to Shriver, whose deputy I became, and I didn't have that much exposure to LBJ during that period of time. But I would get it reflected from Shriver sometimes.
Well, I think we'll read a lot about it.
Let me just
Darrow's
ask
new book.
anybody
Everyone
who
should
can
buy it.
add to this while we're on the Humphrey thing. I was at the 1968 convention. It's always been my sense that Johnson really wanted the convention to draft him, and had they have done that, that he would have come back and run for president. Senator Mondale, what's your thought?
Well, those of us supporting Humphrey thought exactly that. The convention was one night, the big night was his birthday, and if the convention had decided to go for Lyndon, it would have been a birthday party. By the time the convention got it started, we didn't have any opponents anymore. Some of it for tragic reasons, but we should have been the clear putative nominee at the beginning of that convention, so we could have made a more successful convention. The people with the president did not let up on almost anything. We tried to get a compromise on the Vietnam War, and we had the Kennedy people. There was a chance that we could have built a bridge there, but they wouldn't let it happen. And it was only that night when Humphrey gave his acceptance speech and you came up on the platform that the party and the convention was finally his. But it was too late. So I think there was another agenda there.
What do you think, Bill?
Well, I wasn't in the White House at that time. I had left in early '67, but I was in Hubert Humphrey's suite in Chicago. And he had anticipated that LBJ might make a move, but by the time of the convention, I think he was totally persuaded that LBJ was not a force. But I don't know firsthand from the LBJ side. You were there, two of you were there.
Well, I actually wrote a speech for him to deliver at the convention.
Really?
And it's somewhere, I'm sure, in the LBJ library. And then I went, and then I got a call. He was going to come at one point, and I got a call the day the convention started from somebody at the ranch, I don't remember who.
Larry Temple, maybe? Or
Larry Temple, Jim Jones, maybe,
Jim
saying
Jones.
He wasn't, by now there was trouble in Chicago. The president was not going to Chicago. I left the White House and went up to the Jersey Shore with my children and watched it there, sadly. So I don't... the speech wasn't an acceptance speech. The speech was a birthday speech. So, whether up until the last minute, I had no sense I had no sense, Fritz, that he was going to.
And you know that
run.
That is probably true. But you asked me what we thought, and there may have been nothing to it. But there was, because we couldn't get any management of that convention for about 3 days. We wondered why.
I was at the ranch and watched the convention in the office. There was a wing off the main house that contained the president's office. We watched the convention and the riots in that office with the president, who was quite miserable watching it. All that week that the convention was about to happen, the plane was there to take him to Chicago, and everybody was on tenterhooks about whether he would go. But I never had the slightest sense that he was hankering to be drafted. I think that's a kind of novel that people write in their minds. I think he was completely resigned, not reconciled, but completely resigned to the fact that in March he had said to the American people, "I will not seek nor will I accept the nomination of my party." I think that was very close to a Sherman statement. I think he meant it. I think he had deeply mixed feelings about what had happened to him, but I saw no sign during that convention when we were all down in Texas that he wanted to go and be drafted.
Joe?
I think that's right. I do think, I can't remember who was on the floor of the convention. I was not there either. But I do think he was constantly concerned that the party would rebuff him on the war. Remember, Hubert, we all say if he had only made the speech about the war a couple of weeks sooner than he had about Vietnam, he would have been elected president. Remember, he was on the rise. He only lost by less than 1 percentage point. But there was a lot of tension.
To me, one of the most interesting parts of all of that is that he had urged Rockefeller to seek the Republican nomination. I wonder what would have happened had Rockefeller wound up being the Republican
Rockefeller,
nominee.
I honestly believe Rockefeller was his preferred candidate for President of the United States.
It's another
and he
indication.
brought Rockefeller down to the White House in a secret meeting to talk to him about that.
It's another indication of this weird bipartisanship of LBJ. He appreciated talent no matter which side of the aisle it was on, and he had great respect for Nelson Rockefeller's abilities. And I, as a young person in the White House, thought it was strange that the president was so willing to consort with these strange Republicans. But he admired Rockefeller.
Did you mean, Joe, that you think if Humphrey had been the nominee, he would have voted for Rockefeller?
I don't know what he would have done, but I do remember one thing about Rockefeller on that score. People forget, when Rockefeller got divorced and married Happy, it was a big scandal. I mean, it was a big deal in politics for that to happen. And there was a White House dinner, and he was going over the list with Liz Carpenter, and he said, "Ed Nelson Rockefeller, I want him down here," with his new wife, and had him down.
We're kind of coming to the end of this, but I'd just like to go around and ask each of you, what do you think is the quality about Lyndon Johnson that today's politicians would do well to emulate, or what was it about him that they could learn from him that would help them the most? Senator McGovern, what would you say?
Well, I think we've all talked about his great skill in bringing people around to his point of view, or even if they didn't come to his point of view, at least cooperating. I think that was one of his enduring qualities, that he could bring a person of either party into the Oval Office or go to the Senate floor, whatever the case might be, and make a reasonable, persuasive answer. And he left no doubt that this was something that meant a lot to him, and that he felt it was in the best interest of the country. And I think that was his capacity for leadership that made him a great president.
Senator Mondale?
Well, I think what we talked about earlier, Robert Caro talked about, I think he genuinely and profoundly felt for poor people. I don't think it was opposed. And I think it drove his presidency, and he, every day of his life, wanted to make progress and make the lives of these poor people that he knew better. I felt it. I was there the night of the '65 Civil Rights Address when he said, "We shall overcome." That, I believe, is the most thrilling moment of my political career, because I could feel it in him. I knew he meant it. I knew he was going to do everything possible to create what is really a revolution. Mm-hmm. He got civil rights. No one else did. Mm-hmm. He got these big changes in education and so on, all these great, what I call the high tide, because I think he was, despite all of his negatives that we talked about tonight, deep down he meant it with everything in his power, and he had the skills and the intention to do it. And he changed our country, and I think we should be forever grateful to him.
But you'll remember that he knew the cost of getting civil rights passed.
Yes.
In addition to saying we shall overcome, he said, well, when he signed that bill, there goes the South for the next half century.
Right, right.
Bill?
Well, it's hard to reduce that novel of a man to one concluding sentence, but it is to put yourself, when you can, on the right side of how you read history. That's what he did with the civil rights movement. His posture on civil rights was not all that admirable before he became president. And I remember what to me was the defining moment of his presidency. It was a press conference after he was arduously working to enact the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act, I forget which, and James Deacon, who was the White House correspondent for the
St. Louis Post-Dispatch.
St. Louis Post-Dispatch, was at the back of the crowd, standing just a few of the press corps, and standing just a few feet from me. And he spoke up. Jim had this voice that would cut through. And he said, Mr. President, you didn't do very well on civil rights in Texas. You didn't do very well as a congressman. And why are you taking this stand now? And there was this long pause, and I had no idea what he was going to say. And he said, well, Jim, I'll tell you, very few of us have the chance to correct the mistakes of our youth. And when you do it. I have that chance, and I'm going to do it now. He was reading his times in the context of the progressive evolution, start and stops of American government. I would say to any politician today, try to read the moment in the context of the long progressive history of this country, which has been one of constantly fighting, often losing, to advance the franchise of democracy. And that's what Johnson did when it mattered most.
You know, hearing you bring up Jim Deacon. Jim Deacon was a friend of mine. He was still covering the White House when I was the White House correspondent. But I remember that Jim always had a way of kind of holding his head. And Johnson always said, oh, you know, he's that reporter that looks like you just smelled something.
And he usually did.
Evan?
I would mention something that I think is shared by LBJ and FDR, his great mentor and hero, and that is a zest for politics. There has never been a great president who is not also a great politician. And if we have presidents who consider themselves above the political fray, who have a disdain for the sort of soiled, sweaty world of politics in the trenches, they are cutting themselves off from a chance to be great. There's never been a great president who didn't have a zest for political combat, political bargaining, for politics in the raw. FDR was a master of it, a patrician who somehow was able to connect with people from a completely different background. LBJ was skilled. He had what I call operational intelligence, not the trained kind of literary intellectualism that we think of when we talk about intelligence. He had operational intelligence, and it is essential to presidential greatness. And if I were advising later presidents, I would say, do not hold yourself above the fray. Be willing to get into the fray and develop those skills. Do whatever you have to do.
Joe.
I think, I agree with what Irvin said. I think you have to get into the battle. I think he had, in addition to all the political skills, he had such profound commitment. I think he had enormous courage. He knew he was paying a fearful price for everything he was doing, particularly in the civil rights area, as he told Bill about the '64 law. He knew the Voting Rights Act. He also knew that passing a law was just the beginning. And he was right there. I mean, we were filing lawsuits within days after the Voting Rights Act was passed to enforce it. We were calling everybody to get hospitals desegregated after Medicare went into effect. I mean, calling local leaders, and he knew all these guys, and he knew you had to do it, that was just the beginning. And at the same time, he knew how important the law was, because all the civil rights leaders wanted him to sign an executive order on fair housing. And he said the next president can revoke the order. He knew how unpopular fair housing would be. And he said, we've got to get a law. And he got the law. So I would say courage, tenacity, and he loved every minute of schmoozing with everybody on the Hill, everybody, you know, out there that was a politician, that was a businessman, that was a labor leader. And when George Meany recommended something, he'd call the head of the business council to see what he thought about it, and vice versa. He knew how this country ran, and he knew how it was driven and how you achieved something, and he was willing to touch every single lever to get it done. We need that.
I want to just close this with one little personal story. Lyndon Johnson was the first politician that I ever knew or even knew about. The year was 1948. I was 11 years old. And we heard that Lyndon Johnson, who was running for the United States Senate, this was the year of Truman versus Dewey, we heard Lyndon Johnson was coming to the baseball vacant lot on the northwest side of Fort Worth where we played baseball. And we heard he was coming. And it was a big thing in the community. And my dad took me down there. And the reason we were all so excited about going down there is we heard he was coming in a helicopter. And none of us had ever seen a helicopter. This was a long time ago. So on that day, we all went down there, and we're standing there in this vacant lot. And all of a sudden, we hear this big noise up in the sky. And here's this airplane with no wings on it. And we hear coming over this bullhorn, "This is your candidate for the United States Senate." I mean, we were like, you know, Moses when he realized that burning bush. We didn't know if it was a politician. We didn't know if it was God. We didn't know what it was. I mean, just this thing, and it landed, and there was this big cloud of dust, and Lyndon Johnson got out of that helicopter, and he made the most rousing speech you can ever want to hear. And at the end of it, he never took off his hat during the speech. At the end of the speech, he took off his hat and threw it into the crowd, and then got on that helicopter and flew away. Now, mind you, I was 11 years old. I can remember every moment of that day. I can't remember the commercials from the last presidential campaign, but I can remember every minute of that day. Well, let me tell you what. I later told that story to Jake Pickle, who was a longtime congressman from Austin, and Jake said, "Oh, yeah," said, "that was my job in the campaign." And I said, "What do you mean your job?" He said, "Well, I was going to the University of Texas, but my job was to drive around to wherever that helicopter was going and get in the front of the line there, and at the end of the speech, I was the guy that caught the hat." He said, LBJ said he was the tightest guy on earth. He wasn't going to waste a hat on a political rally. So he said I'd have to drive around, catch that hat, then run around behind the helicopter, give it to him, and then he'd go on to the next rally. And every time I think of that day, and I think about how politics was then, and you talk about how he had this great zest for politics, Joe. He got out there, and in those days, politicians knew who the people were that they were talking to. They weren't relying on a piece of paper that some pollster had given them. They weren't relying on some poll that somebody had written. They knew who they were talking to, and I think you hit it. I think all of you talked about it in a certain way. He knew who the people were that he represented. And that's why he was able to do. He knew who the people were in the Senate that he dealt with. He knew who the people were in the government. That's how he was able to get so much done. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you.
Yeah, I enjoyed that.